One thing that I really appreciated about Babel was the lack of this. I think that's the main issue with this book. See, Dark Academia only works with doomed yaoi. The moment you introduce a heterosexual couple, just forget about it. In the light of recent events regarding the Dubai Book Festival and RF Kuang, let's talk about Katabasis, which I must say was one of my most anticipated books of this year, despite the fact that I've only ever read Babel by RF Kuang and I gave that book 1 star. However, after having read Katabasis, I must say that Babel was a billion times better at doing Dark Academia than Katabasis, probably because Babel had doomed yaoi and Katabasis presents a horrendous display of heterosexuality. Like, if you're going to write a Dark Academia book and it's not queer, just forget about it. It could be because the main characters of the book, Alice and Peter, are poorly disguised, shameless self-inserts of the author and her man, who, by the way, the book is dedicated to. Like, now that I think about it, this book is set in hell, and it was a perfect opportunity to address queerphobia in academic spaces, but R.F. Kuang decided to make it a critique of academia itself, which, by the way, in my most humble opinion, I don't think it was done very well, probably due to the excessive dick riding of Cambridge in this book. I'm a little late to review this book, which means that there have already been enough discussion regarding the use of referencing of pre-existing literature in this novel. In that regard, I feel like enjoying Katabasis is really impossible if 1, you have no idea about the subject matter, or 2, if you know too much about the subject matter. So for me, each reference was bullshit after bullshit. Now, I'm not saying that R.F. Kuang is not educated on the topics that she discusses. I just think she didn't do it efficiently in this book, and I'll get back to that later, especially when I'll talk about the concept of hell in this novel. So, what is Katabasis all about? Including numerous sources like the synopsis from the novel, the author talking about it, and how the publisher marketed this book as, Katabasis follows an enemies to lovers story about 2 PhD students, Alice and Peter, though we only focus on Alice throughout the book except for like 1 chapter where Peter shares his history. They are academic enemies who journey to hell together to retrieve the soul of their dead supervisor because he's really important man in this field of magic. I can't stress this enough how many times we're told that he's so important and how without his recommendation letter, Alice is pretty much done in the field. Chapter 1 of Katabasis opens with an epigraph, an excerpt from Plato's Phaeda, and I expected that each chapter was going to have a little epigraph as a setup, but this was not a thing for the remainder of the book. The excerpt is about humans pursuing death all their life, and it doesn't really have anything to do with what we see in the chapter. If I reach hard enough, I could say that later towards the end of the book, the excerpt makes sense, but the placement seems very wrong even at that. This is like the point in the book where it hasn't even started yet. And we're already seeing the author quoting pre-existing literature, which just sounds like a very desperate attempt at presenting oneself as profound. The chapter starts with a quick info dump that Professor Jacob Grimes died from a magical accident caused by Alice. Now, magic is very different in this world and almost makes no sense, but that's low-key the entire point of it in this book. It works through a combination of analytical geometry, logical and philosophical paradoxes, but it's never really formally explained how the two work together. Every time someone draws a pentagram, they base it on some paradox and then they chant a spell on it and basically it works. Anyways, now Alice wants to go to hell so she can get that recommendation letter, and while she's drawing a pentagram that takes one to hell, Peter, her sworn academic enemy, walks in on her. I hated Peter from the moment that he walked in this book. Also, again, you should remember that Alice and Peter are very poorly disguised self-inserts of the author and her man. So Peter sees what Alice is doing and quickly realizes what she's doing, and he says, "Alice Law, you naughty girl, you're trying to go to hell." Ugh, I'm still getting the creeps. Like, I suppose it was intended to come across as romantic to the reader, but I just wanted to throw up. There is banter between the characters, that is true, but they never even once come across as rivals because every time Peter does something, Alice is just so impressed and cannot help belittle herself, and never once did it feel like that this woman has anything against this man. Secondly, Peter is a very shy person who cannot even look Alice in her eyes. And looking back, him saying this to her and this being our character introduction just doesn't make any sense. He's not even like that for the rest of the novel. Next thing he does, He crouches on the floor and starts readjusting Alice's pentagram. He basically makes space so both of them can travel together. Their journey to hell is costing them half of their lives, which is not as important as the recommendation letter. Then we get a glimpse about Alice's involvement in killing Professor Grimes. It was the kind of mistake that could end careers. It would have if anyone had seen Alice's name on the lab logs or known in any official capacity that she was assisting at all. There would have been an investigation, she would have lost her stipend, been booted from the program, been interrogated by the Royal Academy, and been barred from studying or practicing magic at any institution in the world, even the sketchy, non-accredited ones overseas. I don't know if it was sarcasm or the author really is that tone deaf. This book is supposed to be a critique on academia, but the number of times she praises Cambridge and all the other big institutions while belittling the non-Western ones, it sounds like a love letter to European and American institutions. And this is on page 14 and I couldn't look past the nonsense written here. Peter had a very nice spellbinding voice. Alice had always resented that about him. How his voice made her seem reedy in comparison. She found it particularly disgruntling given how incongruous it was with his stick-thin frame. It seemed unfair such a rich sound could come from that stubbly goose throat. Every now and then a research paper surfaced on why male voices were better suited for magic, citing reasons of pitch, depth, or steadiness, and they always sparked a big hubbub involving outraged statements from women in magic societies and apologetic statements from journal editorial booths. Alas, no one managed to conclusively prove these studies false. Unfortunately, Alice suspected the papers were right, and at this moment she was grateful. Peter's confidence made her confident in turn, and she found herself lulled along by his smooth, reassuring rumble. First, let's talk about the bio-essentialist sexism here. No matter how hard I try, I don't understand why the author felt the need to put this thing here. And mind you, it is never talked about for the rest of the book as Alice goes on to perform several magic tricks and none of them are heard her due to her high-pitched voice. Also, this is one of the many times that this book shit-talks feminism and downplays the entire movement as utter nonsense. There is a whole thing about it later in the book where the book shows how bad women empowerment movement is just because of one character whose morals don't align with our main character. And lastly, this whole passage that I just read sounds like it exists so way the readers can know how amazing Peter is. This is a problem that persists throughout the novel, that Alice is never self-sufficient and needs someone, ideally a man, to guide her through. This is just one of those instances and I'll share more as we go through the rest of this book. At the end of chapter 1, there is a sub-chapter that sounds like it's a lecture but we never really find out what it is. There are some other sub-chapters like this later in the book too, but I never found out who was speaking in those chapters, which really pulled me out of the story. This one, however, is titled On Magic, and by the way, magic is spelled with a K in this book, and I guess the author just wanted to sound extra academic with that because these spellings were popularized by Crowley and I reckon he was mentioned in this book at all. I just talked about how this book is like a love letter to Cambridge and we get more of that here. Over in America, visual illusions and flashy showmanship were all the rage. In Europe, they were going on about things called postmodernist and post-structuralist magic, which seemed to involve loss of spells doing the opposite of what their inventors wanted, and spells that did nothing at all, which everyone claimed was very profound, but all the best magic was still done at Cambridge and good traditionalist Cambridge was dedicated to the bare bones of the art. Look, I'm not saying that this book doesn't provide any critique on academia. When Alice and Peter are in hell, we see a lot of it, but it's shown through the lens of hell and how campus life is basically hell itself. Such a groundbreaking statement. When we're actually talking about academia as it is on Earth, that critique doesn't seem to exist, which is one of the major reasons why I couldn't stand this book at all. Then the author explains to us what the sororities paradox is, and after spending a huge paragraph on that, presents a shorter explanation as follows. Come on, you know very well what a heap is. You know it when you see it. It is like porn, and you know that if you shovel giant piles of sand out of the heap, there will come a moment when you can definitely call it not heap. Okay, whatever that means. I don't consider R.F. Kuang a great prose writer. I admire her knowledge of history, but that's pretty much about it. But damn dude, this is some terrible use of metaphor, so ill-fitting that it completely takes the reader out of the book. I know I hated babble, but this is some next level bullshit I wouldn't expect from such an established writer. Did Colleen Hoover ghostwrite this book for her? Chapter 2 opens with Alice and Peter descending to hell, and to put it simply, hell is very non-hell-like. For starters, it has a sun, which again is not like a sun because it's very dim and they can't really tell what it exactly is. Also, hell has moderate temperature. Do whatever you want to do with that information. So where they land is basically the top of hell, and it is a very large expanse of desert where souls wait to go through this gate-like thing, and the souls in hell are called shades, which at first the author states don't have any personality, but from this point onwards, every shade that will come across will have a very defined personality, very similar to the one that they had on Earth. Shades as a concept was very difficult to understand because they are also different and don't really have a standard. Some are just shadows and some are fully formed people with all their distinct features. Alice and Peter start looking for Professor Grimes right away, and they don't find him around this lobby reception of hell. Everyone that arrives in hell has to cross this wall thing through the gate to enter the first floor of hell. Alice and Peter don't have much time, so they basically just climb over the wall. By this point, the author has established numerous times that Peter is very clever, especially more clever than Alice, and then this happens. "What are you doing?" Peter asked. Alice was crumbling a stick of chalk between her fingers. "For the grip," she explained. It keeps you from slipping when your hands get sweaty." "How do you know that?" She dusted the chalk across her palms. "I used to climb in Colorado. I climb sometimes still. There's a mountaineering club on campus." How very American. First of all, everyone and their mother knows about this. It's not rocket science, and secondly, how the fuck is this American? But this is like such an accurate depiction of how an American would assume how non-American people talk. And then halfway through the climb, Peter has a panic attack. "I believe I'm having a panic attack." It was wildly inappropriate, but Alice laughed. "Murdoch, are you afraid of heights?" "I didn't want to tell you," he gasped. "Thought I would just suck it up. It was your idea to climb." "Yes, but I only meant it in theory," he whined. This was a terrible reaction to someone having a panic attack. Secondly, Peter is just stupid as fuck. Like, why would you even go there? Why are you suggesting something you know will become a problem? And the answer to that is given right away. The author just wanted yet again to write a very awkward romantic scene between the two of them. They make it to the top of the wall and you're not gonna believe this. So the wall is not very wide, and like normal people, they don't decide to catch their breath separately, so both of them have enough space to settle. He got one hand on the top, she seized his wrist. He got another hand up just far enough for her to pull him up and over. One great heave, and then Peter collapsed on top of her with a shout. They lay still for a long moment, breathing hard. Alice felt something wet against her skin. She tilted her head down and saw Peter's face crumpled against her neck. These are supposed to be enemies, by the way. Like, the lack of development in this whole romantic plot is so annoying and frustrating to read about. One thing that I really appreciated about Babel was the lack of this. I think that's the main issue with this book. See, Dark Academia only works with doomed yaoi. The moment you introduce a heterosexual couple, just forget about it. She would have wriggled away, but Peter was still shaking a bit. Alice thought inappropriately like a man after sex, and she thought it better to leave him have his moment. She laid her head back and closed her eyes, relishing the sweet fatigue that pulsed through her limbs. I genuinely cannot understand the intent behind this whole thing. And can this woman stop talking about dick? A slow burn between two people paired together who wouldn't want to be in a situation would have torn through this shit. But this book just jumps to provide these people with a romance storyline a little too quickly. They spent the third chapter doing all that and climbing back down in chapter 4. He tumbled the last meter but landed all in one piece. Alice jumped down beside him and landed sprightly on her feet. This hurt her heels, but she had a silly urge to impress Peter. People in the climbing club were always impressing each other by landing like cats. Sadly, he did not notice. Enemies. And she's trying to impress him by chapter 4. Look, it could be a bad marketing choice to say it's enemies to lovers, but the problem is that Alice was coming alone and Peter forced himself into her plan, and she took it because, quote-unquote, Peter is clever and better. Fine. Still good. Like, I just don't understand why Alice would want to impress him at all. Like, we do find out that they had a thing back in the past, but we don't yet know what went down. But it seems like they were in a situationship. Imagine trying to impress your ex-situationship. Alice, dear, get off the floor. You know, I really thought I was going to die. He shook his head. Dear God, I've never felt so sure I was going to die. I wouldn't have let you die, Alice said blithely. The words just rolled off her tongue since they seemed so obviously the right things to say. Though the moment she heard them out loud, they felt off. Those were very easy utterances between loved ones, even between friends, between any two people friendlier than wherever Alice and Peter were right now. Alice is like really annoying about Peter, and I really wish she wasn't. None of this sounds good, and it feels like the plotline is moving faster than the character. Professor Grimes is my best shot at getting a job. No, of course, Peter said quickly. I mean, same here. Oh please, what's that mean? You're Peter Murdoch. Aren't they falling over themselves to hire you? It feels like Alice is probably the only one who regards Peter so highly, and from how much we as readers know about him, he's not all that interesting. He's just a typical white boy who doesn't shower and has poor organization skills. And then she says every department in the field had a raging boner for Peter Murdoch. There are so many awkward dick jokes in this book and they all just feel so out of place. Alice then finds out that Peter won this fellowship type thingy and for some reason she is really pissed at him for not telling even though these two literally don't talk to each other and until visiting hell together would avoid each other like the plague. Yeah, sure, whatever. Apparently, Grimes had assured Alice that she'd get the Cook Fellowship, and we get another slice of casual misogyny here. You'll get the Cook he had assured her all these months ago. Oh, they'll love you. You'll be the best candidate they've seen in years. They've been dying to nominate a woman. You're a shoe-in. And since back then Alice still believed every word out of his mouth, she spent days after that conversation delirious with glee. The thing is, Alice really just accepts it, even though it's such a backhanded thing to say. And Alice is not a child. She's a PhD candidate, but her immaturity was really bothersome to read. Also, Alice doesn't have much different views from the men in this book either. On the next page, we get some conflict. Peter was supposed to go to Rome with Grimes, but Grimes took Alice instead because Peter was ill during those days. Alice brings that up because Peter brought up the Cook Fellowship, and on the next page they resolve it because quote-unquote they only have each other. Suppose we bracket all problems for the living, we can't fight down here, love, we've got to trust each other, we're all we have. She sniffed. Fair enough. Look, I am sorry I brought up the Cook. And I'm sorry I brought up Italy. They call it a night and for some reason hell gets cold and they share a blanket. This was such a stupid thing to do in a book about hell, but I'll prioritize my sanity here and try not to make sense out of it. So far, hell has not really felt very hell-like. It's like a liminal zone where nothing really happens. Even later in the book, the conflict is always caused by humans inside the hell. We get more of Cambridge dick writing, and then we hear about people who don't get post-grad degrees. And there was no magic without the academy. Universities supply the chalk, the syllabaries, the pentagram repositories. Universities publish the journals which determined which spells were valid and which ones weren't. Of course, there was such a thing as hedge witches, typically PhD students who had failed out, terminal masters, or college graduates who had never gotten into a graduate program at all. And they weren't entirely bereft of resources. Many hedge witches scrounged up their own chalk and organized amateur conferences and published in poorly rated journals about their wonderful discoveries. In fact, some of these discoveries are quite interesting. The open secret really was that sometimes the hedge witches founded stuff that even tenured professors couldn't imagine, but none of it was going to be published in Arcana, and so none of it had credibility. The thing with this book is that you can never really tell when she's praising academia and when she is criticizing it. Also, this book is very misleading in terms of what Alice wants. Towards the second half of the book, her motives are completely different from those at the beginning, which is expected from a novel for your character to change, but it is such a drastic change that Alice at the beginning and Alice at the end of the book sound like completely different people. Anyways, we have finally made it to chapter 5. Alice awoke to Peter's arms slung over her chest. She registered this and before throwing it off, lay there for a moment considering. It did not feel terrible. Hell got very cold at night, and the warmth Peter emanated, she'd forgotten how hot he could get. Really, he was a proper furnace. Was rather nice. These are our enemies, y'all. Also, can we talk about hell being cold? The concept of hell being cold? I'm sorry, what? And this passage I just read out? You guys are not going to believe what happens next. Something hard dug against her thigh. Jesus! She scrambled away, yanking the blanket off them both. Peter awoke with a panicked what? Then he glanced down at his lap and yelped. Oh my god. Oh my god. I don't know if this was supposed to be cute or funny. I'm just getting secondhand embarrassment. And this is supposed to be a dark academia book and the author cannot stop making dick jokes for some reason. You know, I wouldn't mind if this was done like once or twice. But we're getting this every chapter and I just want them to stop. But they don't, and we have to talk about the boner for the entirety of the page. These people are running out of time and haven't even reached the first court of hell and they're having awkward conversations about dicks and falling asleep in each other's arms. I'm pretty sure that everyone who read this book was surprised at where all of this was coming from in an R.F. Kuang novel. Alice and Peter talk about their maps of hell and... well, Alice peered down at his notes frowning. Peter's map of hell looked bizarrely like a pizza. An anus really. I can't express how I felt when I read through all of these terrible jokes. And the whole anus joke does not end there. The river Leith runs perpendicular to all 8 courts and marks the boundary of reincarnation, so hell looks less like a pizza anus, excuse me, and more like, she continued without clarification, I don't know, a Mobius strip. Delete bounds all. You're trapped on this plane until you're done, and then you go somewhere beyond. I don't think I have it in me, so I'll just put the maps on here so you'll know what Alice is talking about. Also, hell is a hyperbolic space, so even though it's curving and everything, it appears as a straight path to them, and they need to go through each court to enter the next one and cannot skip any. And even though it is Alice's map, Peter understands it better, and it just makes Alice come across as someone really dumb, which is like such a huge problem with this book. By the end of chapter 5, hell is inside and it turns out to be a campus. I was fascinated by that concept, but the more I read, the more I realized how making hell a campus was a terrible idea. Just reading through the parts of the first court, it was evident that the author just wanted to use the concept of hell as a scapegoat to flaunt her knowledge on hell and to use it as an excuse to criticize academic structures. Other than that, hell served no purpose. So Pride is a library. The world building of hell was already faulty, but here it just falls flat completely. They meet a shade there who tells them that every soul gets a transcript that tells them which course they need to pass, and if your transcript has pride on it, you need to define the good. You need to read through books to find the answer and then answer it to the deities who are taken from Chinese mythology, even though the structures in hell are based on European and Catholic depictions of hell. Rebecca borrows a lot from pre-existing literature on hell and imposes academia on it, and it passes off as her own creation. Though the hell that she presents is very much her own imagination. I mean, look at it. It's the most boring depiction of hell in the history of literature. It's a melting pot of various ideas. Hell is just a scapegoat that she uses to produce a critique on academia, like the structure of hell is completely based on Dante's interpretation. But for some reason there are Chinese deities. Hell is different across religions, and mixing it up produces a chaotic and non-functional world that is really hard to get through. I just can't get past the fact that hell was so Eurocentric, taking from how white people presented hell, and suppose someone is illiterate and stuck in Pride. Wouldn't someone who is educated find it easier to get their way through? I understand that this novel is about academia, but this is fiction and you still need to make sense of the world you've created. Otherwise, perhaps just go write a non-fiction book to brag about how much you know about how white people perceive hell. Anyways, Alice and Peter quickly realize that Professor Grimes is not going to be in Pride, so they leave for the next court, Desire. As they walk out of Pride, they find the river Styx, which is called the Leith in this book. For the eternity of the next chapter, we get to know about Leith, which is composed of water that dissolves all of your memories and it joins all the courts of hell together. I was really too stupid to understand how the hyperbolic space works, and I felt like the book could have done better job at diagrams because these two-dimensional diagrams of hell were not helpful at all. I did not find anything interesting in chapter 7, and this chapter also included a subchapter called On Chalk. At this point, I realized that these subchapters were nothing more than infodumps, and I wish that the information was given to the reader in more creative ways. Babel also had this issue when the author was misusing footnotes in the most non-creative ways possible by giving information at the bottom of the page that would have worked absolutely fine within the text of the book. By this point, if you have not realized, Alice is a reference to Alice in Wonderland, and the author was too unsure that her reader would get this very on-the-nose reference. Rebecca does this in chapter 8 in such a terrible way that it causes a huge inconsistency to Alice's character. Before reading out the text, I just want to share that earlier in this book, Alice is introduced as someone so passionate about her career in academia that she would rather die than not have the recommendation letter from Professor Grimes. And as we all know, hell itself is not scary at all in this book, not so far at least. So Alice and Peter are joking about different brands of chalk, and Alice abruptly starts crying, which threw me off really bad because she's crying because she thinks that she'll die in hell. Sorry, Alice wiped her eyes. Oh, this was terrible. To break down in front of Peter Murdoch of all people. Now he would certainly think she'd gone mad. Sorry, I don't know why. Day 2 in hell, and Alice is already going mad. This scene also serves a romantic purpose, which I was so done with while reading this book. It's poorly written and it is straight. Like, I think I could excuse if at least it was yaoi. On the next page, we get another passage where Alice is belittled so Peter can be put in a better light. Everyone Alice knew at Cambridge was constantly on the verge of a breakdown, everyone but Peter, for whom life was only a lark through the meadow. Peter took the worst news with a blink and a shrug. Professor Grimes would impose the most insane deadlines and Peter would only laugh. This, however, is not the Peter that we as readers know. Peter is not half as clever as the book makes him out to be. And for some reason, every time he needs to be praised, the book has to put Alice in a bad light. This is not an issue with Peter, but with Alice. Her accomplishments never feel earned and she constantly needs someone to help her through. This was done to the point where it became increasingly difficult to keep up with Alice. And if contradictory characters weren't enough, the author also tosses aside the entire magic system in the same chapter. When it came down to it, magic was not really about how much complicated maths or logic or linguistics you had. Rather, the final push to make a spell work was just the power of belief. It wasn't about the algorithms at all, it was about self-deception. You had to assemble enough proof to convince yourself the world could be another way, and as long as you could trick yourself, then you could trick the world. Since the author never establishes how maths and logic work to make magic happen, this passage further solidifies that the magic system is not properly developed. Reading this book never felt like it was written for the love of fiction. Mostly, it's just the author writing paragraphs of a logical paradox where she's not adding anything and just quoting philosophers who actually put in the work. This book also couldn't be a non-fiction book because at its core, the book doesn't provide any thesis. It just references a whole lot of pre-existing literature with nothing of substance added from the author herself. In chapter 9, they make it to Desire, and Desire is basically a student center. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me how. I have no idea, and the author never bothers to explain why does hell look like a campus. Hell, a very universal concept. Why does it look like European university? Like again, hell looking like a campus serves no other purpose than a backdrop for a critique of academia. It is so impractical as a concept for everyone who dies on Earth. It was just frustrating to read through. In Desire, everyone had a room where they are indulging in their deepest desires. The author tries to make it look like a bad thing, but when you really look at it, the souls trapped in Desire, they seem to be having a pretty good time, to be honest. Again, it works well for showing the state of student centers, but it fails to depict the second court of hell. A few doors down, they heard a loud snuffling noise. A shade sat hunched over a table in the corner. He held books up close to his nose, and every time he turned the page, he sniffed up and down the spine, eyes rolling to the back of his head with pleasure. Carry on, Peter grabbed Alice's wrist and tugged her along the hall. What was that? She hissed. What was he doing? You've never sniffed a book before? Not like that. I was very surprised when I read this book. It could be that me and every book reader I've ever come across belongs to this very specific room in Desire, but you're telling me you've never sniffed a new book like it's fresh Coke? I'm calling bullshit. Alice and Peter decide that Grimes is not here either, and they leave Desire as well. By now, I was a little confused because as much as we know Grimes from the backstory bits we're getting, I think that man 100% belongs in any of the first courts. But for some reason, the main characters never spend much time in the courts, so both in the first and the second one, it felt a bit boring because once the author makes her point, the characters just move forward. Also, I should mention that only the first and second court really look like a university, but maybe the final court as well. The rest of the hell is just really blank space with hardly anything going on, which again was a letdown. I'm just amazed how terribly this author has fucked up the concept of hell. You could play around a lot with it for the amount of references she makes to Dante's Inferno. She could perhaps contextualize it in this book, but she never goes there. So as they leave Desire, they are caught up in a storm. I have no idea why hell's weather is so similar to Earth, but it is like that. They still manage to leave and reach the third court, which is greed. I wasn't a fan of how they were passing through from one court to the next so blandly when they're quite literally moving through a hyperbolic space. The entire concept of hell in this book suffered from lack of creativity. In chapter 10, we get a twist which is more of a reveal because it's not very well foreshadowed and again feels like it just came out of the blue. So Alice cannot forget anything, like anything at all. She tells Peter that when she was traveling with Grimes, the professor tattooed a pentagram on Alice that kept her from forgetting anything. And following this information, Rebecca dug another grave. Remember how I said that if you actually know the stuff that the author is referencing, the book just sounds stupid as fuck. Here's how it goes. She couldn't suddenly read fluently in French or Arabic, but she could if she sat long enough, flipped through mental dictionaries to compile passably good translations. Entire worlds opened before her. She learned Cyrillic, Hungarian, Nastaliq. She learned Linear B. Nastaliq is not even a language. It's a typeface that is further used in several other languages including Urdu and Punjabi, and yes, you guessed it correct, Arabic, a language that she stated in the same passage she couldn't read. I'm just sharing this so you can judge the quality of references spread across this book. Yes, pathetic. Earlier in this book, I had the issue that the magic system was never formally established and whatever we knew about it was contradicted anyways. Everything just feels like it is referenced with no actual thought process behind it. They made flashy gadgets for toy companies, the best among them sought residencies in Vegas, the worst among them became consultants. No doubt magic was on the decline, and this was merely a symptom of a world where children did not read but sat drooling over a screen, where artists plastered paint at random and thought themselves Michelangelo's equal. No one knew how to think anymore. This was probably the worst take in this book, and quite frankly, I don't even know where to begin. The book is roughly set in the 80s, and this whole screens thing was not a problem back then, as Rebecca claims here. Secondly, it is such an ill-informed critique on art, completely ignoring historical context when she's talking about surrealist and abstract art. But the funniest part is that this is just a self-call-out. Speak for yourself, Rebecca, about no one knowing how to think anymore with the way the references of historical literature feel so out of place in this book. This happens at like page 160, and this was the moment where I realized that this book was just a bunch of bullshit that the author studied at college and didn't really know how to infuse into fiction. And even at that, it is not accurate or educated takes on things and just come across as ignorant. This would of course be fine if your character is just meant to be ignorant, but these are PhD scholars we're talking about, and the author herself is a PhD scholar, so this just feels highly distasteful. So this chapter ends with Alice looking through Peter's diary while he's asleep and notice that Peter intends to sacrifice someone in hell, and Alice simply concludes that he wants to sacrifice Alice to retrieve Professor Grimes' soul. This is such a poorly formed conflict because you just know that Alice is misunderstanding something here. It's because so far the author has made it clear numerous times that Peter is all-knowing and Alice is just dumb. And Alice jumps to that conclusion so swiftly that you can't help but think that she's just not right. Also, there's been no indication or foreshadowing that would actually make the reader believe that this is the case. Lastly, they are definitely headed towards a romantic arc, so you can't see the bullshit from a mile away. Making Peter a douchebag would have 100% worked here, but we haven't seen Peter like that. In my head, I imagine Peter as the kid from Horrid Henry. Stupid as fuck but prized for absolutely no legit reason. You know, this book is set in the 80s, but while Alice and Peter are in hell, it just doesn't feel like it. As Aristotle put it, sentences can be ambiguous in their meaning but not in their truth, so either the statement that Alice and Peter are friends is true or it is false. The statement cannot be some mysterious third thing. From talking about children being glued to their screens to meme templates really popular on Twitter, this book comes across as unedited because why did no one catch all of it? The book further tries to make the conflict that's very much on Alice's side believable to no use. Peter was flaky, yes, but Alice had never once heard rumor of him acting maliciously towards anyone. If anything, he was famously unnecessarily kind. Everyone adored him despite having every reason to hate him. Less more talk, everyone said. Annoying as all hell, but his heart's in the right place. You know, to make this sort of thing believable, Peter needed to have acted in some way where we could remotely believe that. This just keeps on further proving that Alice has misunderstood Peter's notes, which is again really frustrating because I wish Alice was not portrayed as this dumb girl who doesn't know better. Her entire thing with Professor Grimes is that she worships that man and never thought that he was ever in the wrong. That's why she even agreed to let him mutilate her with that tattoo that keeps her from forgetting stuff. Like, this is a very distasteful description of how advisors abuse their advices, but you know, it would have been more interesting if Alice had any agency. This just makes Alice sound like a desperate girl in academia who reeks of internalized misogyny. One of the major reasons why I couldn't stand Katabasis was its depiction of hell was entirely dependent on European perception of hell, which occasionally references to Chinese mythology. Every other culture is always secondary opinion in this book and makes it sound like a myth in the book when hell pretty much exists in every culture and religion. Bhishma said in Mahabharata that from covetous covetousness preceded sin. St. Paul warned the church that money was the root of all evil. So here now were the proper schemers, the one who knew what they were doing and deserved to pay. Like here, the author only references Hinduism to make a point on how this very Western version of hell is valid. For context, our main characters have made it to the third court of hell with pretty much no development in the plot or themselves as characters. This book established some traits and just never looked back. She wished she had thought to bring hiking sticks. She kept tripping against the rocks and Peter kept catching her, which irked her because she hated to still find comfort in his presence. It was a horrible paradox, the fact of his intended betrayal on one hand and the empirical evidence that he was still Peter. The Peter she remembered, the Peter she liked. Like, Alice thinking that Peter is betraying her genuinely feels like one of the worst conflicts that I have ever read. It almost reads like a first draft when it comes to Alice suspecting that Peter is going to betray her. Like, she is not even trying to be enemies with him. If anything, after reading through his notes, Alice has only started liking Peter more. There has been no build-up whatsoever, and the author completely fucked up the one conflict that would have remotely made this whole relationship somewhat interesting. But she couldn't help but feel a little sting every time he brought it up, as if she disappointed him by being born to the wrong sort of parents with the wrong sort of face, without connections, without a cock. As if he were coaching her to run a race they both knew she'd already lost. This is about Alice and Professor Grimes, and to give you some context, Professor Grimes comes from a poor background and had to work his way to the top. And here the author is comparing Alice's situation to Peter's. Thing is, Peter's parents are famous, but he's also really good at academia without their help. And Peter is not really a very strong case of nepotism because there is nuance to his character that defies that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Secondly, the passage randomly throws in sexism and racism in Alice's context and making it sound like that she is behind because of her race and gender, when we've never really seen that hindering her success in the actual story. Also, now that I know how the book ends, all of these arguments surrounding academia seem just pointless by the time the book ends because Alice's motives are completely different by the end of the book. Ugh, this book frustrates me to my core. The thing is just... man, this just pissed me off so bad that I just hated Peter from here onwards. So this is a flashback where Alice overhears Peter talking to another guy about Alice. Alice would always remember how easily the words slid out of Peter's mouth. There were words you said to create an effect, words constructed to influence your interlocutor. Then there were words you simply believed, had believed all along. Words just waiting for the right broth to spill. Oh, her? Said Peter. No, I wouldn't say she has a problem. What do you mean? I mean, she's like a bird, said Murdoch, hopping where the seed is, eating right off his hand, burrowing from his warmth, said the guest. Warmth, Peter drawled. The nastiest sound Alice had ever heard Peter make. There was the sound of fists against palms, some unquestionably vulgar gesture. They both laughed. I'm supposed to like a man who slut-shames his lover-to-be. I just do not understand why Alice is so obsessed with Peter. Despite knowing all this book has a problem where it presents a miscommunication to the reader and then several pages later it addresses it fully. So later we do find out that Peter thought that Alice was having an affair with Professor Grimes, but like, does that really warrant to talk about your colleague like that? And like, Alice frustrates me so much. Girl, get off the floor. This man is a huge misogynist. But again, the amount of internalized misogyny Alice has, I'm not surprised that she likes him anyways. They've made it into Greed, the third court, and suddenly hell doesn't look like a campus because why not? Greed is a bridge, and that's pretty much it. You know, hell is supposed to contain a lot of souls, and here the depiction of hell is really empty. Secondly, the entire thing just comes across as really underbaked. As we go through the remaining quotes, you will realize that the author just didn't bother to do anything with the world building in majority of the mid-section of this book, as her focus drifted more and more towards referencing classical works instead of focusing on her own story. Again, the court is ruled by two deities who have nothing to do with the European idea of hell, but they are just there. On the bridge of Greed, Alice and Peter face the Weaver girl who comes from an Asian folktale. She has a power that has something to do with clothes. Alice and Peter have an argument on love thanks to the Weaver girl, and it was one of the most boring conversations ever. The Weaver girl puts Alice and Peter in a riddle and presents them with two apples. If they pick the red apple, they get to go, and if they don't, then one of them has to stay. It's a bit more complicated, but at its core, it's really just that, and Alice and Peter are separated for the test. Alice ends up trapping Peter, and there's this really cool scene where the Weaver girl wraps Peter up in several layers of fabric. It would have added some of the nice takes, but Peter is trapped trapped for like barely 5 minutes because someone comes out of the blue and saves them both. Chapter 13 is just backstory of when Alice and Peter first became Professor Grimes' advisees and worked together, and one day Peter just became really distant. Instead of going through all of this, I'll just tell you that the chapter exists to tell the reader that Alice had fallen in love with Peter but never really got to tell him that. I wasn't gagging. Like, at all. I just really wish there was something in this book that really showed why Alice ever fell in love with Peter. And more importantly, I wish that Alice was defined as a character through her own lens and not by how her relationships were with the other characters, especially men around her. It made her character seem really weak and one-dimensional. When I really think about her now, all I can think about is how she was with Peter and how she was with Grimes, and there's barely anything that really tells you about her relationship with herself. We only get fragments of that when I personally believe that when you're in university, the person you get to know the most is yourself. Chapter 14 starts right from where chapter 13 left off. Peter is trapped on the bridge and a boatman who's wearing armor comes and rescues them both. And in chapter 15, we find out who this boatman is. It's Elspeth, a former advisee of Professor Grimes who ended up committing suicide. And here in the beginning of chapter 15, I noticed a piece of self-plagiarism. Alice knew this face, she knew this name, she wasn't supposed to know it. All mentions of Elspeth were scrubbed from the department records. A framed photograph of every year's cohort hung along the department walls, except the class of 1975. All the faculty liked to pretend Elspeth had never existed. If you have read Babel, you'd remember the same thing happening there. Griffin, who was Robin's brother, had a similar thing going on in Babel where his name was removed from everywhere in the university. Not that I was expecting anything good from this book by this point, but this was literally Sarah J. Maas type of flow that I wasn't personally expecting from R.F. Kuang. Similar to Babel, Elspeth becomes sort of a guide for the main character and a plot device that Rebecca absolutely abuses for the sake of info dump. Hell is infested by skeleton-like creatures that Alice and Peter had no prior information on. These creatures are scared of Leith, and that's the most they know until this point. Elspeth tells them that they are creatures made by the Kripkes, a couple who used to be really popular magicians, and they tried to do a round trip to hell with their son, and they basically got trapped here. They've been trying to return to Earth ever since, and they have their little army of dogs made out of bones. After this info dump of several pages, Elspeth leaves Alice and Peter to go hunting, and Rebecca presents us with a display of amateur writing once again. Since being rescued by Elspeth, this is the first time that Alice and Peter are alone, and Peter addresses the fact that Alice trapped him on the bridge, and Peter is really angry at her for doing that. "I'm sorry for back there." "Oh, you are?" A lump formed in her throat. "I didn't mean to. I just looked down and the apple jumped into your hand?" Peter snorted. "We had a plan, Law. It was so easy." "I know, I just condemned me for fun. I didn't know. What we know is that Alice believes that Peter is going to murder her in hell. But have we ever seen her act like it? No. And the only time that she remotely tries to even go there, she says that she acted involuntarily. The whole thing about Peter trying to trap Alice in hell just doesn't sound believable at all, and you can see through the bullshit from a mile away. And mind you, this is literally the conflict that the book provides, and it is handled so poorly that you cannot even believe it. I would have loved to see a flawed character, but Peter is presented as a golden boy who can do no wrong. I find the characters in this book really inconsistent, as if the author tried to make them one thing and they turned out to be something completely different, and no one in the editorial department seemed to care about it. In the same chapter, Peter tells Alice that she's wrong, so whatever conflict there was falls off entirely. "Your notebook," she says helplessly. "I saw it in your notebook. The spell for exchange." "Exchange?" His eyes went wide. "You thought I'd exchange you?" "Jesus Christ, Law." He still would not look at her. "You have no idea what you're talking about." And then Elspeth returns, gives them more info dump about the Kripkes and her uni life and all that for the remainder of chapter 15. Elspeth also tells them that the magic can work in hell. You just need chalk and blood is also the reason why Alice and Peter are so vulnerable to the Kripkes, because they steal blood. In chapter 16, Elspeth talks about Professor Grimes, and I really liked that she called him what he was. He was not the reason why. He was not. I refuse to give him the credit. He was just a symptom, you see. It took me many years to realize this. Every time he yelled at me or picked me apart or humiliated me in front of other students, This was just the whole symbolic order coming to your head. This is an arbitrary game of egos and narcissists and bullying perceived as strength, but he was the perfect incarnation of the system's nonsense. Like this kind of generalizes how people in power at academic institutes are, but the problem is that Elspeth killed herself and Alice sees it as a weakness throughout the novel. Here was the line between them. There was a way out, Alice knew, because she'd perfected the game herself. You learned to read his moods. You fawned when he turned on you, growled when he demanded an apology. It wasn't so hard, as long as you sacrificed your dignity. Realizing this gave her tremendous relief. She didn't have to follow down Elspeth's path. She was tougher, she wanted it more. The author here seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of why people in academia end up killing themselves. And even if she does understand, here she just brushes it off in a very ignorant manner, and it is always more than that. I noticed that this was a recurring problem where the main character just believes that it is a matter of toughing it out. This did not sit right with me at all. I feel like chapter 17 was the point in the book where the book just goes to hell. Yeah, pun intended. So Alice realizes that Elspeth has the dialetheia, which is basically again an object based on a paradox that something exists in a place where it cannot exist. Alice and Peter plan to trick Elspeth into giving it to them. They just need to put Elspeth on a pentagram and obtain the location of the dialetheia. If we can get to it first, then that's all our problems fixed. Then we've only got to get to Lord Yama's court and wait, we can bargain for Professor Grimes' life and our own exists besides. She paused, and then you wouldn't have to exchange me, you know. It just confused me a lot because Peter literally just told her that this is not what his diary entry was all about. So like either Alice is just really stupid or dense on purpose. Either way, it was really boring and completely sauceless, and I wish there was better developed conflict to drive the characters forward. Earlier, it was stated that Alice had never been in a relationship before, but here we randomly get to know of a past relationship. This relationship once again serves no other purpose than to make a point about academia. You're a teacher's pet, Alice. You have a fetish for validation. Is that so? Alice, whose mind was only on the prospect of fat envelopes from Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, and Yale arriving in her mailbox, barely registered what he was saying. Indeed, it took her months to realize this nasty monologue had been his attempt to get her into bed. Yes, I suppose that's right. This can't be worth it. But of course it was worth it. It was the only thing that was worth it. Like, I feel like the academia critique doesn't really hold up very well when it comes to Alice, and this book's obsessive dick riding of Cambridge. I'm just so tired of reading about how amazing Cambridge is again and again. I wouldn't be surprised if this book was written for PR purposes. This book squarely lacks in critique of how Alice takes academia. And remember how I just said that chapter 17 is where this book just completely goes to hell? No, prestige was not the point. Elspeth was wrong. Elspeth has invested all her hopes in the wrong symbols. The symbolic order, the paper publications, the applause, the job postings, the grants was not the point. Even the Oxbridge credentials which Alice's ex had assumed were solely what she was after were not the point. Those were all instrumentally valuable to secure what Alice really wanted, which was unhampered time and access to the necessary resources to think. This was why she kept at it for years. This was why every graduate student she knew didn't mind the low pay, the exhausting teacher assignments, or the non-existent healthcare. This is one of the major contradictions of this novel. The entire premise was that Alice needed to get the recommendation letter from Professor Grimes because without it she wouldn't secure a good job in the field. And here it says the opposite. If Alice doesn't mind low pay and exhausting teaching assignments, she could just switch the advisors. This book suffers extremely at the hands of editing and required several more revisions so the motive could at least stay consistent. From here onwards, we see Alice transform into a completely different character without any defined force or by circumstances because the point that the author wants to make with this book cannot be made by the character like Alice. This book is a critique of academia and Alice cannot say anything bad about big institutions like Oxford and Cambridge where the author herself has studied. If you're an aspiring writer, you should take this as an example why self-insert is a bad idea and even seasoned authors mess it up when they try to do that. I've already stated that this book brings up a lot of historical text, but it also tries to make it relatable and there are a lot of poor attempts at making it funny. It just ends up being cringe altogether. But what about dreams? Peter asked. Who is having the dreams? A half-consciousness. Michelle insisted. A soul neither living or dead. An imprint. An eidolon. Peter found this absurd and Belinda found it romantic, and they all had a go at dissecting its implication before the conversation abruptly turned to the question of whether it was alright to have sex with trains, particularly if it violated Aristotle's teachings that things should be used for the given functions. Then what about people who use toothbrushes to masturbate? Michelle wanted to know, which made Belinda blush. And then under what particular circumstances one could, if one wanted, have sex with trains? Alice sat watching, cradling her beer, and she was so happy she could have cried. Here she belonged, here she could utter things, could be honest about where her mind had drifted, and they wouldn't look at her like she was mad. There is so much to dissect here. First of all, the conversations that the students have here are so, I don't know, anti-intellectual. Like, it tries so hard to pass it off as profound philosophical debates, but at the end of the day, it just sounds like conversations teenage boys have in high schools. Throw in a quote from Aristotle and voila, that's enough intellectualism for today. And like comparing having sex with trains to jerking off with a toothbrush, like, what the hell? I just hate how much this book talks about sex, and it was really bothersome to read through. And lastly, the whole thing about people not thinking that Alice is mad. This whole Alice in Wonderland thing is too on the nose and doesn't really work. The passage makes it sound like only 5 people ever go to university. Chapter 17 ends with yet again a horrible and pathetic take on suicide. It was this simple. Alice loved her work. It was only the social world, the institution that got in the way. Yes, it was aggravating. Yes, it was a world of hurt. But unlike Elspeth, she was not ready to give up on all of it. Elspeth was wrong. It was not devoid of meaning. There was something still worth fighting for. Alice had located something in that cloud of symbols, a value that was not nonsense, and she believed in it with her entire being. She believed in it still. She only needed to survive the rest. Katabasis talks about suicide in this really condescending way, and I haven't seen anyone talk about how horribly the author handled such a delicate topic. While reading chapter 18, I took a lot of notes because almost every problem I have with this book shows up in this specific chapter. First of all, let's talk about hell. As we know, hell is a hyperbolic plane, so it is safe to assume that the laws of physics are very much present in this world. Now, I'm gonna read a passage that defies the laws of physics for quite literally no reason. She realized she had no grasp on how wide the leaf was, or indeed if its thickness was regular at any point. None of the maps really knew what to do with the leaf. It inverted geography. How far had they drifted into hell's uncharted domain? Without the moon above or any banks in the sight, they were only 3 figures on a little boat sailing on an eternal black plain, with no end and no beginning. I can ignore that no one is sure about the structure of Leith. Sure, no one has ever been able to explore all of it, that makes sense. But we do know that gravity very much exists in hell, right? Even if it is a hyperbolic plane. And there is also a sun. I just don't understand how the leaf is so contained if there is such a huge star that passes over it every day without a second body like a moon pulling it with the exact gravitational force. The leaf should be violent as fuck and wrecking over the banks and spilling onto the land of hell. But for some reason Elspeth's boat is calmly rowing on top of it. I just don't get why author completely overlooked that aspect. Either don't make the world based on physics or just try to comply by the rules if you so badly want to pander your readers with your knowledge. And now let's talk about the fantasy elements of Leith and how underdeveloped it is as a concept. You can never be sure in this book how the hell Leith even works. I thought the Leith couldn't hurt shades. Peter said, the draft doesn't only cleanse your memory for rebirth, but unfiltered water straight from the river that can destroy you. I'm very careful, stuck my pinky in once, just the tip. I wanted to see if it would hurt, you see. And did you sense it? Asked Peter. What you were forgetting? Not at all, said Elspeth. That's the most frightening part. You never know what you lost, you don't get to choose. It's like the Leith is 2 things at once and it is really confusing. What the Leith does, it doesn't hurt, but it also does in certain cases, but the harm in question is just rebirth. And earlier in the book when Alice and Peter trip into it, it was an entirely different thing. Anyways, it gets worse when Elspeth starts talking about the Kripkes. You said that the Kripkes don't fear the Leith, said Alice. What did you mean by that? They don't, said Elspeth. No, they court it. I've even seen them drinking its water just once. They stood at the bank in a line taking tiny sips from a bowl. It seemed like a ritual to them, like they'd done it before. This is very contradictory when you know what happens at the end of the book. The Kripkes and their army show up at the Leith in the final chapters of this book, and they very much fear the Leith, and it plays a vital role in the end. And like, one of the reasons why the Kripkes are terrorizing hell is because they don't want to forget where they come from and want to return to Earth. And lastly, Elspeth always travels by the Leith on her both because it is the safest way. So none of this nonsense even make any sense. I'm sure you're also noticing how halfway through this novel is just completely falling apart and throwing out everything it had built in the first half. Alice and Peter look out at the rest of the grid, but they don't see any campus like it is in the first two courts, and Elspeth is like, it is like the university buying space but never building anything on top of it. I get that how she's trying to criticize how academic structures keep a lot of wasted land, but ma'am, you're building hell here. If you can't pull your head out of academia's ass, you should have set your book on a campus. Don't you know it? Elspeth gestured. The dead space where the campus ends but the rest of the world hasn't started, where faculty and no one else lives, where the university's bought up land but not built anything on it, where construction continues but nothing is ever built, where space is in becoming for ages. Haven't you been there? Like, this is such a bad and boring concept for hell because, like, why is hell based on a system created by humans when the entire point of hell is to judge humans? Also, academia is a very cut off place and inaccessible to a lot of people, but hell is something that a lot of people are experiencing. The comparison really falls flat when you think about it in that way. Academia is limited to a certain demographic of humans, and hell is just simply not like that. And then another shade shows up. Professor Karpov, said Elspeth. He's been there for a while, always hungry. The name rang a bell to Alice. Wasn't that the man who plagiarized his students' papers for years and got away with it, said Elspeth. They said he died of a stomach virus, but I think one of his students laced his apples with cyanide. Good work if so. Again, everything that happens in hell, every soul we come across, has to be related to academia because that's what the entire book is about. You know what would have been really interesting? If we were seeing non-academics trying to navigate through this space, but all we're seeing right now are scholars and academics who are discussing the same thing in hell that they were discussing here on Earth. Overall, a very joyless experience to read this sort of hell. I mean, I get that hell is not supposed to bring anyone joy, but I don't think boring people to death is the point of hell. And hell is also such a unique concept that you can explore a lot of prejudices and wrongdoings of people in it, and the author is just hell-bent on why Cambridge is just so good and how certain teachers should not be a part of it. Again, I know that that's just not the main takeaway. I'm aware of the intent this book was written with. It's just that all that is falling really flat and comes down to really basic things. We see more shades in Greed who are fighting, and Elspeth says that that's all they do in Greed and that they don't notice anyone else. They just keep bothering each other. What are they doing? Peter looked aghast. Hell if I know, said Elspeth. I've poked around before, tried to find out. But they won't talk to me. They're the only shades that won't talk to me. They tugged away from the shore. Professor Karpov raised a hand towards them, plaintive, supplicating. Elspeth wiggled her fingers in return. Do you see a lot of people you know here? Alice asked. She was trying to think of a subtle way to see if Elspeth had spotted Professor Grimes. Oh yes, far more magicians than you would expect actually. So like, do the people in Greed talk to her or no? It feels like the conversation went suddenly from Greed to overall hell, but then again Professor Karpov was in Greed and he knows Elspeth, but she just said that no one talks to her. See, it is just a mess overall in the second half of this novel. Alice took a shaky breath and turned back to the beach. Elspeth's bucket was nearly full. She saw Alice looking at her, straightened up and waved cheerily. Alice waved back, feeling rotten. Half resolved, she thought. Professor Grimes had taught her this. The difference between greatness and mediocrity was only ever about following through. Anyhow, this was a good thing, the merciful thing. Elspeth had to be put out of her misery. One conversation, that was all it would take. Like, again, I'm just really hating how Alice thinks she knows better than Elspeth, and like, this whole self-righteous bullshit is so annoying to read. Like, such ill-informed writing on suicide and mental health. What was the thought process behind it? Like, I get it that Alice wants to take advantage of Elspeth, that adds to her character, but it's a whole different thing how she acts like she knows more about Elspeth's mental health than Elspeth herself. Elspeth delivers a lecture on karma, which is a very clear evidence that Rebecca went to white people's school of using words you don't understand the meaning of. She presents a very white people's perception of Hinduism and mixes it up with Buddhism. Elspeth's eyes narrowed. You two seem very invested in persuading me to give up. I'll die. No, I'm just trying to understand. Alice's mouth had gone dry, she swallowed, which did not help. Seems strange to keep chasing after something that doesn't exist when you could just, when it would be so easy to just go on. This part really struck me because, again, Alice doesn't know Elspeth's situation and she just got to know her for a few hours and already acting as an expert. Another reason why she's doing it is to trick her to step on the pentagram they've drawn. Like, this is such a low hanging fruit to use suicide as an excuse. Just shameless and embarrassing on the author's part, honestly. There is a cat that goes in and out of health throughout this novel, and right when Elspeth is about to walk into the pentagram, the cat jumps in, and Elspeth figures it out that something is going on. She gets very angry upon finding out what Alice and Peter were trying to do, and that they're in hell to find Grimes. She then kicks them off of her boat and vanishes. So in chapter 19, Alice and Peter are again lost in hell and don't know anymore what to do. Alice and Peter have an argument about Alice leaving Peter on the bridge at the mercy of the Weaver girl, and then Alice for some reason brings up her name in Peter's diary, even though at this point we've gone through this numerous times. Peter gets really angry for her bringing it up again and again and then tells her to make the rest of the journey herself. Alice stared after him for a moment then followed. She didn't have a plan, she only knew she had nowhere else to go, and if she lost Murdoch, she was lost altogether. It's shit like this that really pisses me off when I'm reading this book. It's like the author completely forgot that Alice had prepared to journey on her own in the beginning of the book, and now suddenly she has no plan and she would be lost without Peter. This is so frustrating. I hate this aspect of the book where Alice is always seen lesser without the men around her. It would have been really great if it was shown that she's actually good on her own and it's people around her that undermine her all the time. But what this book actually does is put it all on Alice's internal monologue that reeks of internalized misogyny. And like even at the end when Alice is all on her own, the villains literally just do the work for her, and I'll get back to that later. In chapter 19, the author had run pretty much dry of her creative juices, and hell just becomes really empty from here on onwards with barely anything interesting. They make it to Roth, which is basically just a bog, and most of it is submerged in water. Let us go as far as tyranny, Alice proposed. If we don't stop to sleep, then we can cross two courts in one day, and the chances are better than not that we'll find Professor Grimes there. You can see from here how hell is no longer an important point. In this book, they're talking about going through 3 different courts at once. It eventually comes around at the end, but that's just to wrap the book up. And so far, Hal has been really convenient to the plot, making the characters only see things that are important to the plot. The people we have seen all went to Cambridge or are established musicians, and we haven't seen anyone other than that. It just makes Hal look really empty. In the same chapter, Roth comes and goes, and now they are in violence. While they are navigating, they fall into a trap based on Asher stairs, so basically no matter how much they climb, the stairs there just remain in the trap. Also, this is where the cover was inspired by. Alice and Peter talk a little because they no longer have anything to do. Here, Peter is like, it was stupid to come to hell and all that, and then he gets really angry at Alice for some reason. It doesn't really make any sense, and then he gets mad at her again for wanting to find Grimes as if he didn't equally want that. Eventually, Alice tells Peter that she's the reason Grimes died and that's why she wanted to come and get him. Chapter 20 is a backstory, and we're back in Cambridge, and there's a lot to address here. That the academy was sexist was such a boring truism that Alice was no longer disturbed by the fact. When in 1893 the Cambridge University Centre proposed granting full degrees to women, protesting students hung an effigy of a female cyclist at the end of King's Parade. When the proposal was dropped, the protesters decapitated and tore the effigy apart in celebration. It took nearly another century for all the Oxbridge colleges to admit female students. Magdalene was the last and only began admitting women the year Alice arrived. On the first day of term, the male students wore black armbands and the flag was flown at half-mast. Since there was a general consensus among the women of Alice's cohort that feminism was an embarrassing fad, a bygone fever of the 70s, Alice certainly wanted nothing to do with it. She was not interested in reading Kristeva or Irigaray, in comparing everything to a phallus, in altering language to take the his out of history. She couldn't believe the screeching activists who believed the only political just thing to do was to become a lesbian. Girl, where do we even begin? Like, I really hope the author does not stand by these statements, but since the book is not written from Alice's perspective, we can never be sure. Like, there's nothing more depressing than a colored person trashing feminism. And there's something about I'm not like other girls trope that's so outdated and boring that practicing it in this book is not just out of place, but also really distasteful. And the evident queerphobia that's sprinkled throughout this book is really why I absolutely hated this book. First, we got that bioessentialist bullshit in the beginning, and now this. Like, why are queer people suddenly in this? I thought this book was about straight people, Rebecca. And it doesn't stop there. In college, Alice had shared several classes with a girl named Lacey Cudworth, who regularly burst into tears when she felt her classmates argued in a very male way with her or insinuated that women were not good logicians. Occasionally, Lacey turned to Alice for solidarity, and Alice rebuffed those overturns. Do not come to me, she thought. We are not alike. She thought Lacey gave women a bad name, that her complaints justified everything men believed about women, and that Lacey was focusing her energies on the wrong issues besides. This is crazy coming from Alice, you know? She's an academic who lets the entire trajectory of her career and life be directed by men. If anyone, it's Alice who gives a bad name to women. Like, it was wild reading through this book and know that a very celebrated writer wrote this crap. Like, we are really in the shambles. The bar is literally in hell. Like, even when other girls are showcasing signs of being impacted by the sexism, Alice just brushes it off as a skill issue. It's disgusting and a very wrong way to put a real issue. If anyone had asked Alice why she never reported Professor Grimes for any of the things he'd ever said or done to her, she would have explained that there was nothing to report because it was all her fault. The fault part is too long for me to read, so I'll just summarize it. So, when Alice found out that Grimes is a pervert, it thrilled her and she started analyzing herself through that lens. Fair enough, but it doesn't stop there, and gets even weirder. She realizes that Grimes fancies her and starts finding herself superior to other women, and the I'm not like other girls trope continues. Alice was both attractive and restrained, and this made her feel superior even as she witnessed Professor Grimes disappearing into hotel rooms with other women from the conference. Alice was different from them. They were wives in the making, and she was a magician. It enforces the notion that you can either pursue a career or become a wife. Again, it's crazy coming from Rebecca, who is also pursuing a PhD while being married. This entire thing reads really hypocritical, and this was one of the weirdest parts in the book. Alice never really addressed her morals, and it just stays like that, which really made me confused if it was actually a critique of how academia treats women, or if it was tooting your own horn for being better than other women. Plot-wise, I just want to point out how out of place this whole Grimes and Alice relationship thing feels. It's only coming up after Peter accused Alice of being in a relationship with Grimes, and it never bothered Alice or made her think about it until Peter said so. Partly, that makes it feel like Alice letting her thoughts be manipulated by Peter, which again makes the whole point of her character as a woman in academia really redundant. So, one time, Alice was working late in the lab and Grimes brought in Charlotte and they start making out without realizing that Alice is there. From here, we get another flashback from the time she was traveling with Grimes, and Alice and Grimes go to his office to pick up some papers. At that moment, it seemed the most important thing in the world that she find those handouts. They were just here. Alice, said Professor Grimes. She stood, turned around, he crossed the room and took her face in his hands. Now, what I hated the most about this part was that none of it was foreshadowed. In fact, Alice took pride in never being approached by Grimes, and the specific thing just felt a little low-hanging fruit to make the reader dislike the professor. It would have been believable if Grimes ever showed any interest in her, or if we had actually seen Grimes being a pervert. You know, Alice had assumed that Grimes was attracted to her, but whenever we saw her interacting with him, he was very cool towards her and an overall bitch to her, honestly. So his pervy side could be done better, I think. Later, she says after that night, Professor Grimes turned so cold, which is factually untrue because Grimes had always been cold since the start. Word had spread and Alice overheard. Eventually, every single person in the department had some opinion on Alice, whether it was pity or condescension or abject curiosity. Still, Alice was used to rumors. She was a crime student after all, and she could have weathered it all if it were not for Peter. She could not bear the way things had changed with Peter. He became unbearably awkward after that night. So far, Grimes was described as a private person, and quite frankly, it made no sense to me why he went around telling people about his romantic endeavors. That's not just what the kind of person he is, and then the whole thing with Peter is just very inconsistent. One, Peter had already suspected their relationship and had already slut-shamed Alice for that. And second, Peter tells a different story about the same time. We will eventually find out that Peter was actually just sick. I'll get back to how poorly the whole illness thing is handled in this book when I get to that part. At her lowest, she tried again to seduce him. She wore those black ties and short skirts he'd once said that he liked. She kept her blouse tops unbuttoned. She tried every old trick in the toolbox, sitting with her legs suggestively crossed, bending down lower than she needed so the curve of her ass was still on full display. I'm here, she tried to tell him. I'm willing, have me. He pretended she did not exist. This book tries really hard to make it sound like a power struggle when the main character is literally doing a PhD and is hellbent on having Grimes as an advisor when other options are available. Secondly, this passage I just read out is just utter crap. I don't understand why a grown woman is doing all that. Like, considering the fact that Grimes doesn't want to do anything with her, it could have been done in a much better way. But considering we already know how Alice saw these kind of things with other people, I find it really hard to sympathize with. Secondly, she didn't really learn anything because even after Grimes died, she went through all the trouble to go and find him again. She sought counsel in the office of Helen Murray. Helen did not particularly like Alice, not because of anything Alice had ever done, but because she was a Grimes student, and Helen Murray and Jacob Grimes hated each other. Helen and Alice talk, and Helen addresses some of the internalized misogyny that Alice has, but it is only shown as a bad thing on Helen's part. She talks about how anti-feminism isn't cool and the struggles of women before feminism was a proper movement, and Alice's takeaway is just very stupid. It occurred to Alice that Helen had been waiting a long time to say these words, had banked up this secret, watching her and Belinda and the others in the halls, awaiting the first one to stop by. This was not about her anymore. It was not even about Grimes. It was about Helen getting her word in, and Alice was merely the audience. And then here is some more. Helen leaned forward. The difference between women like me and girls like you is that we always understood the battle was never over, but you can't just cry wolf when things don't go your way. What you must realize, Alice, is that you cannot just take refuge in feminism when it suits you. I'm not crying wolf, Alice said desperately. I need guidance. I honestly don't understand if this is just the character or the author speaking. Feminist movement is bashed throughout this book, and every time someone speaks on it, the book makes the person sound like an absolute stupid person. And Alice is so persistent on being an anti-feminist. I wish we could get a more nuanced take on feminism by showing advices of a woman, and if the author really wanted to criticize feminism, it could be done in a much better way. But all we get here is how men are always better advisors. What was devastating was not the touch. He had hardly been violent with her, no. What hurt was how easily he could reduce her to a thing, no longer a student, a mind, an inquisitive being growing and learning and becoming under him, but just the barest identity she had ever been afraid to be all along, which was a mere woman. It was such a fucking cliche. Downplaying how sexual abuse impacts victims? Like, I wonder how much lower can the author go? Like, sure, maybe Alice has psychological issues regarding the sexual abuse, but the way Rebecca addresses the whole thing is just very misogynist, as if being a woman and experiences these things is the real issue, instead of the men causing all the trouble. And no, it is not such a fucking cliche. Chapter 21, and we are back in hell, and the last chapter was basically Alice telling all of that to Peter. At last, Peter said, "But you were so sure." About what? That he wasn't in desire. Desire is for lovers, said Alice. That wasn't love. Desire is for lust. But sure. How you would have gotten Professor Grimes out of here alive? He let go of her hand. You saw my plan. What was yours? Might as well, Alice thought. She dragged her rucksack towards her. I'm not sure I had one. What's that mean? I kept telling myself I was here to get him back. She fished out her notebook. The binding was waterlogged, as were the edges, but the pages were still dry and legible. But you know what? I never really cracked it. I kept telling myself time's ticking. You've just got to go. You'll figure the rest out on the way. But this was all I came up with, and I'm not even sure it would work. Alice is a character who's not shown to be a very accomplished or even good at stuff, and now we find out that she never really had any plan on how she would get out of hell. I hate her. I hate her as a character. This is genuinely so stupid. But Alice does tell that she was going to trap Crimesoul in a very painful lock through magic. How would you have kept him alive? I didn't really think that part through either. Indeed, there were many parts of her plan that she had not thought through. How to explain a reanimated corpse to the rest of the department. How to keep Grimes from screaming for help. How to convince a dissertation committee that the hoarsely blethering pile of rotted flesh and bones was in fact the soul of Professor Grimes speaking and not a paid undergraduate hiding under the floorboards. Like, the more I read this book, the more it kept falling out. Nothing was well thought out, and the author clearly never bothered to edit such parts to make the character not turn out to be so utterly stupid. Meanwhile, she wasn't even getting the recommendation letter for him, so like, what was even the point? The book is not abiding by its own plot and becoming a completely different thing altogether. Like, development is one thing and things can change along the way, but it's just like the reader was unaware of the plot from the beginning and we were told a thing that was not even true. Again, this is known as bad editing. Well, because I killed him, Peter's face worked terribly. I mean, his death is my fault, not yours, so it stands the reason I should bring him back. This really pissed me off because there was this one thing to Alice's credit that she was the one who caused the death of Professor Grimes, and now she doesn't even have that anymore. And now we get a really long flashback chapter of Peter to get an explanation. Peter Murdoch was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and a stick of chalk in his hands. For him, academia was a playground, not a battlefield, and he was just as good at all the games. After stating the obvious, the author goes on a rant on how Peter still had it difficult because he became a little too careless, and we get to know how he was basically a born mathematician. The way Peter saw it, he was only happily solving the next problem as it appeared. He didn't notice his tutor's jaw slackening over the R. He's astonishing the post-grad reporter to his father. He doesn't belong in year one, you've got to get him out of there. Like, Peter is not a very strong case of how white people have it easier. Later, we find out that Peter had Crohn's disease. Most of his life, he was homeschooled, which resulted in lack of friends, so his parents bring in some kids for his birthday. It results in Peter seeing himself as a superior to other children. The entire thing with Peter's illness is very underbaked and lacks a fundamental understanding of how chronic illness makes your life different from day to day. It's all just cramped up in one chapter and we never see it in other parts of the book, which just really makes the whole thing seem like a plot device more than actual representation. So it's not really believable. Academically, Peter was gifted, so like it wasn't really interesting on that end either. And in this chapter, we mostly just learned how Peter is just quote unquote good at everything. He first went to Oxford and then he went to Cambridge where he met Alice. Peter had never known anyone like her. Prickly, stubborn, ridiculous Alice. She had an underdog's persistence and artist creativity, and best of all, she thought so differently from everyone he trained with at Oxford. Perhaps it was the American influence, or perhaps it was Alice's off-kilter sensibilities, but something about her mind was, well, rhizomatic was the best way he could describe it. She didn't think in straight lines, she was always zigzagging outward. But we are halfway through the book, and we're yet to see this Alice that Peter speaks of. The Alice that we know only revolves around the main characters around her and doesn't have any original thoughts of her own. Her morals are exactly those of a 1900s white man, and everything that she has done so far is all thanks to the man right next to her. So I don't know what Rebecca is trying to sell here. Beast was never vanquished, only banished into hiding. One night he was eating spicy curries and drinking gross cardamom lassi at the Indian place across the bridge. The next morning his stomach was tied with telltale cramps, only mild just yet but a harbinger of things to come. I will bet good money on the fact that there was no such thing as flavored lassi in the UK in the 1980s. Hell, it wasn't even a thing in the Indian subcontinent by that point. And you know what? I'm not even going to bother with the fact that she called Rue Afza Road cardamom drink. Like, what the hell even is that and why are you adding it to lassi? That will taste like shit. I get that Peter has an illness causing all of this trouble, but quite frankly, if you're having spicy curry with Rue Afza lassi, a bad stomach is guaranteed. His illness obviously becomes a problem in his academic life. But you look just fine, said Professor Grimes, who must have not been looking very hard, for Peter by this point had lost 20 pounds and could count all his ribs in the mirror. I don't care about Grimes not noticing, but Alice was very close to Peter during this time, and her not noticing him losing 20 pounds is just crazy. Actually, it's unbelievable considering how she's been said to be a very considerate person when it comes to Peter. If we got all of this foreshadowed or referenced, it would have had actual impact. Eventually, Peter doesn't get the credit for the work he did with Grimes and also doesn't go with him, and Alice actually gets the spot. He's Grimes, for heaven's sake. He has a million projects going on all the time. He shouldn't have to steal. You're doing it again, said Peter. Doing what? Valorizing him, defending him. Always make him out to be this great, larger than life genius. Well, because he was. He's just an asshole, Law. No, he isn't. Her voice hitched. There is no point to why Alice keeps defending him, and even though she eventually gets around, but it's still very distasteful that at the end of the day it's a man telling Alice all of that. She never figures anything out on her own. It just feels very, I don't know, not fun to read when you're reading a book about a POC woman in academia. And then Peter tells Alice how Grimes used to belittle him by praising Alice. Are you blushing? She pressed her hands against her cheeks. I am not. You'll take the compliment, even now. He shoved at her shoulder. Like, Alice will do anything for male approval, and it's very frustrating to read about, and I was not having a really great time suffering through this bullshit. I've been wondering this myself, whether we really needed Grimes to become who we did, because honestly, I think anyone could have made us good magicians. He just convinced that we had to suffer for it. Just had me thinking, even when I was on the bathroom floor, that I wasn't tough enough. That if I just wanted it enough, I'd be all better. He snorted. Stupid. This is basic stupid shit. Something you figure out when you're doing your bachelor's. Like, I'm sure this is brand new only to someone who never went to university, because you get shitty teachers from the start and you figure this stuff quite early in your university life. The way these people talk, the kind of conversations that they have, and the kind of problems they deal with are all very, I don't know, beginner level. The only skill issue here is PhD students acting like undergrads. Peter's pen spun frantically in his hand. Well, consider this. In Book 4 of the Inferno, Dante asks Virgil if any soul that was not saved by Christ had ever been rescued from eternal limbo. And indeed, Adam and Abel and Noah, among others, had been blessed and raised to heaven. God broke his rules just for them. No one takes Book 4 seriously. I mean, I too have some bones to pick with Dante, but the point is, even Dante's version of hell includes exceptions. The underworld yields and bends. It is unpredictable, it follows no order but its own. It is just as Borges said, certainty that everything has already been written annuls us, renders us phantasmal. And yet we are not phantasmal, not annuls, because nothing is fully written. I read through this really chunky text to show how the book makes a fool out of itself by completely diminishing the magic system it created while trying to hinge onto Dante's Inferno. If no theory of mathematics can ever be complete, because for any reasonable mathematical system there will always be truths that the system cannot prove, that just means that magic doesn't necessarily have to abide by the rules as well, but it does. And if they can get out of hell, even if there is no possible magical systems to do so, then the system is just bullshit altogether. I don't know if it makes any sense to you, but I found it to be a huge plot hole in this book. At some point, Peter also told Alice that he intended to swap his life for Alice's to get her out of hell, and he basically didn't want to live because of his illness, which was ableist as fuck on Rebecca's end. It only ever felt like Rebecca used Peter's illness as a plot device to get over some plot holes, like getting them out of hell and giving Peter some, personality. Anyways, Peter finds out a way to lift Alice out of the trap they've been in for the past couple of chapters, and we get back to their romance, which is both badly written and insistently bland. Another point is that it makes the whole thing with Peter seems pointless, like he just came to hell to sacrifice himself for Alice. But then again, the point I've made numerous times already, Alice is not self-sufficient throughout this book. Like, we get one scene towards the end, like I mentioned before, that when she's fighting with the villains, but even that, villains low-key aid in her success, It's not really very fulfilling. After arguing with Alice for a good while, Peter manages to throw Alice out of the trap, and for the remainder of the book, we won't be seeing Peter until like the last chapter. And at this point, we have like 200 pages left. In chapter 24, we see Alice meeting Professor Grimes for the first time, and by this point, I was pretty much done with trying to make sense of Grimes as a character. He's been so inconsistent throughout the story. You sound nervous, Alice. I am, she swallowed. Well, of course I am. Don't be, he smiled, and for the first time, Alice understood what it meant for someone's eyes to literally twinkle. You deserve to be here. Yours was the strongest application I've read in a long while. We have already talked about bad bros, so let's not go there, but let me read one more excerpt from the same page before we talk about Grimes. Never let them make you feel like you don't belong. If there's anyone you would expect to make you feel like that in this book, it is Professor Grimes. Like, earlier, we got to know him as this really bad advisor who just knows how to scrutinize his advisees, but then we saw him starting to fancy Alice, and now we're seeing him being as a very encouraging teacher, even though everyone in Cambridge thinks otherwise. Like, I'm sorry, but I won't get over him being attracted to Alice. It just felt like a plot device the author used to make the character bad. We could have gotten a better representation of bad teachers without making him a pervert, or if we were going to make him a pervert, at least make it believable. Now, I know that this is a very real life issue, it just felt like the topic wasn't handled very well, like most of other topics like suicide and mental health in this book. Let me explain that better with the next excerpt I'm about to read. My student, he would say, hand stretched towards her, and suddenly it was like she had a glow upon her. For the first time, people saw her, she spoke, and people listened. So despite everything that happened after, Alice would still always remember that it was Professor Grimes who believed in her first. He'd plucked her out of obscurity, he'd seen her file in a stack of application, held it up to the light, and decided yes. There is probably nothing I despise more in that book other than the fact that none of Alice's accomplishments are earned. Secondly, the fact that she's okay to look past him harassing her just because he believed in her first. Alice Law, stand the fuck up. Like, this passage left such a foul taste, setting feminism back several decades in hopes of forming nuance. Like, if this is supposed to show how women feel trapped in the system, it just did that horribly, completely overlooking the feeling trapped part. Something similar is done very well in the book called My Dark Vanessa by Kate Russell, where the main character is a social outcast who feels seen by her teacher who later abuses her. I feel like it would have been okay in Katabasis as well if the main character's emotional journey was rooted in how academia treats women instead of her having a pre-installed belief of a white heterosexual man. Rebecca grew up rich, and her perception of privilege is widely different from a BIPOC who grew up poor. And I see this issue in both Katabasis and Babel, where the struggle seems more like a plot device than a lived experience. Like, I reckon a person who went to Oxford, Cambridge, and now at Yale can really write academic problems as a universal issue. As I spoke on it earlier, hell is not really important in the huge middle section of this book as we pass through the rest of violence and cruelty with pretty much nothing going on. Not only the middle part of hell is extremely bland, it is also very empty. In the span of the same chapter, she passes through violence, cruelty, and tyranny and makes her way to the final court where we get more poorly written academia critique until the end of the novel. Not only that, in this chapter, she also tosses aside the entire premise of the book. Her original quest seems so silly now. She didn't care to find Professor Grimes. She might be content if she never saw Professor Grimes again. The scales had fallen from her eyes, but she could not imagine any other future for herself. Everything she'd ever wanted now felt so frivolous, their pursuit agonizing. She imagined standing before the dissertation committee, receiving her marks from Grimes, moving on to her own job posting, where other crop of miserable graduate students would come up under her tutelage. Like, I have mentioned it earlier that I don't mind when a book starts off as something and develops into something completely different, but this book started off as one thing and this is like a completely different thing now. But this book started off as one thing and without really developing has become about Alice being trapped in hell with no motives or will. It works really well if you think about it in a matter of universities and how one feels like in a university. Like, you're really excited to get into a university and once you get in there you feel burned out pretty quickly. You know, you'd want hell to play a bigger role than just being a scapegoat for academia. And hell is such a unique and interesting concept that putting it like that just doesn't work. And in the same chapter, she crosses another court and reaches the final court. Mind you, it all happens in the span of a few pages, while earlier courts took them so long to pass through. Alice ends up finding several pieces of paper spread across the court, and they all turn out to be dissertations. A dissertation at the final stage for a concept of hell that is supposed to mimic academia? Groundbreaking. You're seeing how much this book lacks in creativity. Like, nothing works, and the entirety of Hell is just a joke for the most part, used only to reference classic literature and to make a point on how horrible it is to go to Cambridge, even though that's what you wanted all your life. Oh my god. In chapter 26, Alice meets a shade for the first time in a really, really long time. And like, at this point, I don't think I even need to mention the profession of this one because throughout this book, we've only seen a very specific demographic. So anyways, this one turns out to be a musician as well, and he shows her to the city of Dis. Now, this is like where hell stops being hell, and now it's a fully fledged university because Rebecca could no longer drag the concept of hell, and you best believe that she makes the exact jokes that you make in your first year of university. Socrates was put to death for being annoying. Socrates' opinion doesn't count for anything. Was this really relevant in the book? Not really. Not at all, actually. But Rebecca had to let you know that she's read Socrates. But we can ignore that because this next thing I'm about to read really shocked me. Like, it genuinely felt like a white woman had written this. For context, there is a place called Writing Bazaar where you can find books, and Gladys is the shade who's showing her around. Alice thought perhaps Gladys meant Writing Bazaar in the sense that Harper's Bazaar meant bazaar, which is to say a metaphorical marketplace of ideas. She expected a conference perhaps or a shelf of print journals. She did not anticipate a bazaar in the fantastic oriental sense, a chaotic marketplace, stalls and stalls in rows where hawkers yelled their goods and shades drifted through the rows buying and bartering. I don't even know where to begin. Like, this is straight up racist actually. Like, first of all, there is no such thing as a bazaar in the fantastic oriental sense. The word fantastic here suggests something mythical, unreal, or based on fantasy rather than reality. It positions the oriental reality as something outside the normal. This is exactly how white people treat the bazaars when they visit Asia. Secondly, this depiction relies heavily on stereotypical tropes of the Orient as fundamentally disorganized, loud, and disorderly. Alice expects the metaphorical conference perhaps or a shelf of print journals, but she is disappointed by the physical and chaotic reality. This pattern reinforces a colonial mindset where Western culture and organizations are seen as superior and non-Western, specifically Oriental cultures are seen as primitive, excitingly foreign, but ultimately disordered or lowbrow. Ignorant as fuck. Later we find out that in your dissertations you cannot really copy anything, and like, if you take out the fact that this is about academia, hell stops making sense altogether. And while reading this, I couldn't really differentiate between Pride and the last quote because you were pretty much doing the same thing in both the first and the last quote. Alice ends up in a room full of scholars who are debating gender. Yes, they are really debating gender in hell. Tell me you've never thought of gender past the concept of it perceived by patriarchy without telling me that. And the funny part is, they are not just having new conversation about it either. Like, if Rebecca really wanted to write about such topics, perhaps she could have added people from different cultures in hell to show us how different the perception of gender is across different cultures. Anyhow, the conversation travels to Foucault for some reason, and then they start talking about their dissertations again, and I really want to know, why would hell work on human laws? Like, why is what Foucault said relevant in hell in any proximity? Why are they writing dissertations, a concept perceived by humans with such a limited history? Like, let me read some of it so you'd really grasp how nonsensical it all sounds when you remember that this is taking place in the final court of hell. Ah, Gertrude, said the chairman, you wish to contribute? Speak up. Gertrude scraped her chair back and stood up. My question is, who wants reincarnation anyhow? Not this again, said Professor Brown. Everyone wants rebirth, that's why we're here. Have you not read The Republic? Gertrude demanded. You are not the myth of Ur. Ajax becomes a lion. Odysseus becomes an ordinary citizen. But the wicked have no right to choose. The wicked suffer in the next life. We've been over this, said the chairman. We have no evidence that karma affects afterbirth. These questions mostly seem directed towards the readers, and this is just one of the many instances where this happens. Secondly, I really don't like how the hell is based on European concept with occasional references to other cultures put in like seasoning. Like, the concept of hell is so different than this one in Hinduism, but for some unexplained reason, karma is existing in this version. Secondly, the entire point of Gertrude is the exact same of Helen Murray from Cambridge. She turns out to be a woman who's really just a feminist with extra steps. She's shown as a person who hinders her own growth, really just stating how feminists have gotten it all wrong. There are still 100 pages left, and I'm getting so tired by this point that I physically cannot sit here and go through the rest of this book, so I'll just quickly summarize what happens, because quite frankly, nothing new or revolutionary idea is presented in the rest of this book. So Gertrude has built this citadel where people are waiting for it all to end. Alice stays there for a while and then leaves because she realizes that this is not the point. We're told that Earth predates Hell for some reason, and the whole thing that Hell traps you inside until you get out of it is a lie that everyone in Hell tells themselves. This was so stupid and it pissed me off so much because, again, the entire point was universities and how you are the only one keeping yourself in the university. Nothing to do with hell. Alice runs into a trap that is set by the crypt keys, and it's like a trap from Saw. You cannot possibly escape without killing yourself. Alice ends up trapping a cat in there and she dies, and her blood is spilled into buckets that crypt keys will come to get. Alice makes an armor out of the cat's ribcage and prepares for battle. Gratis tells her to snort chalk, which would give her magical powers, which just further adds to how bullshit that entire concept of magical system is. She fights the army very easily. She draws pentagrams that stills everyone who walks into them. The fight is really underwhelming and hard to believe when you recall that Kripkes are the people who have been terrorizing hell for such a long time. The patriarch of the Kripkes dies by falling into the Leith with Alice, and the mother and son just follow him for no reason. Like, they are nothing without the man of their house, which was again very redundant. Anyways, Elspeth arrives and decides to give Alice to Dilithia because she has realized because of Alice's lectures that she needs to go through the process of hell and let go of her previous life. It's all just nonsense after nonsense at this point. Elspeth takes Alice across the Leith on the boat, and we see Lord Yama, who is described as Hades but make it Chinese mythology. Again, I feel like it's really distasteful to reference your own cultural mythology in regards to Western mythology. Turns out Lord Yama has no issue making Alice meet Grimes, so the entire point of journeying through hell was so she could talk about the bads of academia. Anyways, Alice gets really angry at Grimes, at complaints, and no longer wants to take him back on Earth so she can torture him. Instead, she asks for Peter's life, and a staircase appears that ascends them back to Earth, and the book ends as they peek out of a manhole in Cambridge. Final verdict: this book is ridiculously bad when it comes to creativity. Like, it just hinges off of classical literature and overall just written to criticize academia. Wasted potential, heavily anti-feminist with bits of transphobia disguised as bioessentialism. One of the worst experiences of my life, and I'm so glad that it's over. This is my first video in over 2 months, so if you stuck around to watch all of it, I'm really thankful to you. Give it a thumbs up to appreciate my efforts, and I will see you in my next video, which will be a review of Heated Rivalry. So see you there, and until then, goodbye.